Joining me now with more on Ukraine, visiting research fellow at the King's Center for Strategic Communications, Dr. Vera Michlin-Shapir. Dr. Shapir, thank you so much for being with us. Now, NATO countries are talking a big game of building up forces in Ukraine and vowing heavy response to Russia, but they still haven't even extended an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO. And this is despite Ukraine calling on NATO members to be more forthright with whether or not they intend to extend that ever. What are they waiting for? Or are they actually capitulating to Moscow's demands in a sense by not extending that invitation?
Well, I mean, we have to sort of put things sort of precisely, to kind of put them on the table as they stand. And the situation right now is that Ukraine is not a member state of NATO, and the kind of enforcement that you see from NATO side is actually to NATO member states, which are in Eastern Europe and are bordering with Ukraine. So this is the forces that the United States send, and the forces, the reinforcements that you see kind of coming, the deployments that you see coming from Western countries are there not to deter Russia from doing anything in Ukraine, but rather to sort of build confidence for NATO member states. So this is a kind of a slightly different story, because Eastern European countries obviously also feel threatened by this large Russian deployment in Ukraine. We already heard a sort of a Baltic state saying that, it's first Ukraine, then it's us. So this is to reassure them. This is to reassure Eastern European NATO member states. The NATO never said that it is going to do anything sort of to deter Russia from entering Ukraine by deploying forces in Ukraine. Certain member states are helping Ukraine very seriously, helping Ukraine with weapon systems. But the point was never that NATO is going to deploy in Ukraine. It is true, though. I agree with part of your question, saying sort of what are the Western countries waiting for? Because obviously we see the conflict is starting sort of to unfold. Right. So yes, President Zelensky said yesterday, "What are you waiting for?"
All right. Well, so on top of that, Israel recently actually upset Ukraine by failing to condemn Russian aggression during recent talks with Moscow regarding Israelis and Jews remaining in the country. How can Israel ask for calm without condemning, or at least specifically calling out, the malign actions in question? How does that work in terms of diplomatic discussions, and what do you think that will do to Israel, Ukraine, Israel-NATO relations, etc.?
I think Israel is in a very difficult situation right now. I'm not envious of anyone who is now among decision makers in Israel, because Israel is walking a fine line. Russia is in Syria; it's calling shots in Syria, and Israel needs this relationship to be working and predictable. And I think to some extent, Western allies of Israel, so the United States, also need this to continue to work. So Israel is not sort of free to do whatever it wants, and there is a big issue here to follow for Israeli decision makers, and it is that once this conflict reaches a kind of open, and we're seeing that it's going in that direction, a sort of open phase of open hostilities and so on and so forth, it will be extremely difficult for Israel to continue to walk this line. And so Israel would have to find a new kind of understanding with Russia for how it responds to Ukraine, because not responding to what happens in Ukraine would become a non-option for Israel, I believe, in the future.
All right, now my final question, on top of all of the other military, quote-unquote, exercises that Russia has been conducting along the Ukrainian border, the Russian Strategic Nuclear Missile Force began some test launches this weekend. Is Albert Einstein's famous warning coming true? Is a third world war on the horizon? And is Putin crazy or zealous enough to actually deploy nuclear arms in the conflict? Or do you think that that's all part of the chest puffing against NATO?
So we saw this kind of exercise. We saw this kind of exercises happening in the past. It's true that within the current context of high tensions, this kind of gets a different interpretation. I don't think that the Russians are seriously sort of considering this option, but I think that yes, this posturing is it kind of reminds us why this is why it's not sort of a regional problem. Yes, why this is such the situation in Ukraine is part of a much bigger problem that the world is facing right now, which is that Russia is a nuclear state, and Russia has been posturing with its nuclear arms for quite some time. So even if this is not a real kind of scenario for this situation, it reminds us that this situation is not sort of a local aggression.
All right, Dr. Vera Michlin-Shapir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
ILTV Plus, your news from Israel and more 24/7. Start your free trial today. Subscribe at iltv.tv and watch from any device.